Discussions in Depth Psychology is powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute. Your host is Bonnie Bright. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Discussions in Depth Psychology, which is powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute. I'm Bonnie Bright, and I received my own PhD from Pacifica, and this series is dedicated to really engaging with some of the people who are most involved in depth psychological practices and theories, and also who are out in the field working from a depth psychological perspective. And today I'm here with Jonathan Rudo, who is a doctoral candidate at Pacifica Graduate Institute in the Community, Liberation, and Eco-Psychology program there. Jonathan, thanks so much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you today, Jonathan, because you have been doing a lot of work with the Diné people, or also known as the Navajo people. And so we're going to dig into some of the field work and the perspectives that you have gained during your work there. But first, let me read your bio so that everybody has a little bit more background on you, and then we'll jump into the conversation. Jonathan Rudo is working toward his PhD in depth psychology with emphasis in community, liberation, and eco-psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute, as I mentioned. His work has brought him into communities such as the Black Mesa Reservation land in northern Arizona, where he spent several weeks working with the Diné to learn more about their cultural struggles and ways in which they persist despite ongoing colonial and industrial onslaught, as well as the Sristi village near Pondicherry, India, where he was able to work alongside persons of varying abilities who are working together to build a more inclusive lifestyle for themselves and their community. Jonathan is now beginning his dissertation research, which will focus on deciphering a methodology for decentralizing the worldviews of persons of privilege, pinpointing Caucasian American males who are straight and neurotypical for the purpose of better understanding their parts in creating a more equitable and tolerant future. Wow. So, Jonathan, this is a really large undertaking, and that is to really begin to challenge some of our enculturation and the worldviews that each one of us has grown up with and that our culture emphasizes on so many levels. So I wonder if we might begin by talking about that very briefly, and then we'll launch more into the specific work that you did at Black Mesa. Why don't you start by saying something about this whole idea of decentralizing worldviews of persons of privilege, because that's a very critical piece of what I know to be liberation psychology from my own experience at Pacifica.
Absolutely. I think that really at the heart of all of this work is turning the lens back onto ourselves, both as researchers and just as people and members of communities. So it's really my work, I think. As you've stated, I've gone into several communities across the world, really. And the thing that I noticed the most is that no matter how I attempted to approach it, there was always some sort of wall that I was hitting, that I myself was creating, which is my own perspective, my own lens that I was attempting to capture these people and these communities in which they live with and inside of. And that lens is never fully the truth. It's never fully exactly what and who those people are or how they themselves would like to be viewed, especially in a context where they've allowed you to come in and to conduct your research or to ask specific questions that maybe they don't find of interest to themselves, and then to share it in a context such as this across the world in places they've never been and in many cases will never go. I found that very strange, and I found myself consistently noticing where I was really failing, failing not so much in my own endeavors, but failing the community themselves that I had been working with, because when I really reflected on it, I realized I was always making it about myself and trying to share it through my own lens. So I think that the main work is really to be consistently trying to break down those lenses, to be very self-critical, and to start to form a methodology for how can we do this as white people, as men, as Westerners, as able-bodied and minded persons. How can we do this in a way that is the most inclusive and that's the most respectful?
This is just such a critical topic, and it's also very refreshing to hear you be able to frame it in that way, because I had a similar experience, obviously, in my own education at Pacifica, and I think that that's something that they do really well, is to bring this kind of awareness to students, to researchers, to those who are going to be going out into the communities around what is it exactly that we're doing. Because as you say, we're never able to completely set aside our own perspective, our own biases, our own lenses. As much as we'd like to do that, it's not very easy to do. In fact, it's virtually impossible because some things are just so ingrained in us and we don't realize it. And then the other part of the question which you brought up, which I hope we'll come back to later in the conversation, is the whole idea around what happens to the information that you gather when you go out into a community that is not like your own, and how is that affecting, maybe even sort of invisibly, the people from whom that information initially originated. So these are critical topics. It's a wonderful basis for field work, for research, for digging into any kind of a culture or a community that is different than one's own. Let's start to focus in a little bit now on the Black Mesa Reservation land and your work with the Diné there. And maybe the first thing that we should do is address the question of why call them the Diné when most of us know them as Navajo.
Yeah, and I'll try to use or be as close to some of their own words as possible in what I have heard. And again, this isn't to generalize. Speaking with several families and several of the elders of those families, when asked that question, really what they told me is firstly that Diné means the people, which is very important. It's not just the definition, but it holds weight in being kind of a descriptor of who they are, because when they look at or when they speak about the world, there are the animals, there are the plants, there's coyote, there are these different figures, and the people is just one of those figures. And that figure, the people as a group, is all one figure. So they don't see themselves particularly separate from other human beings. And I think that that's a particularly poignant thing to really be aware of and something that we could all learn from. Secondly, it's that Navajo was actually a term that, in their words, their enemies coined them. It's a term that they were given and not one that they had taken upon themselves. So I think that is really an important thing to keep in mind.
Absolutely, and I think that will come up in our conversation around what actually is happening with them now, and obviously some of the historical events that have occurred to them. Why don't we talk about the location? Because you've spent a lot of time at this place, Black Mesa, and I'm not sure that everybody is familiar with that, but if you can give us an idea of what Black Mesa is and how you came to it in your work.
Yeah, so when on the reservation they are speaking of location, firstly, I think it's important to note that location for them is something beyond what it is for us. Location is something that holds weight because there are stories attached to these particular areas that are part of their teachings, not just educationally, but also spiritually. And it's something that connects them with that exact piece of land, not just the land or the environment as we tend to view things, but with that exact place. They are a very place-based people, so it's important for them to be located in that one area. So when they say Black Mesa refers to, generally, in my understanding, the coal that has been discovered to be at that site. I'm not sure if it was historically known to them to hold that mineral before, but now they're well aware, given that that is one of the main issues. So Black Mesa is a very particular mesa that is on the reservation land that is up northeast of Flagstaff, Arizona. There are a few very particular places. There's Big Mountain, there's Star Mountain, and Black Mesa is one of those very particular places. So that is where, on the reservation, I was particularly located.
Yes, and that discussion about place and our relationship to place is also such a critical piece of depth psychology, eco-psychology, psychologies of liberation. And I know that there are some people who are doing really profound work on this relationship to place, and a lot of it comes about from beginning to dig into the historical roots of the first peoples and people that belonged to the land before the Europeans arrived. Can you tell us a little bit about how you first came to Black Mesa and what your experience of it was? What was your impression when you first arrived, and how did you begin to work with the people that were there?
My first visit to Black Mesa actually was during my undergrad studies at Northern Arizona University there in Flagstaff. I heard about a support group called Black Mesa Indigenous Support and heard that there were opportunities through them to be connected with various families out on the reservation to not only go and visit and see the land, but to go and help. And it was at that point that I started to learn a bit about some of the main issues facing their community, namely the Peabody Coal Company and the several mines that have been built there. So my first impression of the area was, I suppose, from my own perspective, the complete devastation of the communities there because of a large lack of resources, you could say, that was very apparent. Their water needs to be fetched from various well sites that are very few and far between, spread across a very large piece of reservation land. It can take, depending on that specific family's location, it can take upwards of 4 to 5 hours to get to one of these places. And then it takes essentially the rest of the day to harvest that water and to bring it back. And they have to do this sometimes weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, depending on how large water containers they personally have. So I think that was one thing that I, coming from my own place and community, had never really put much thought into, aside from little musings here and there of things people were doing over in Africa or some other area, but it wasn't something I associated with being right in my backyard. So my first impression was how hard that initially hit me.
Right. Yes, I had the same experience when I had the opportunity as well to visit a Navajo reservation. And it shocked me to a pretty deep level because, like you, I didn't realize that people were actually living without running water and in some cases even electricity. And I mean, I was very naive, and I'm sure there's a lot of stuff I still don't know, but it really spoke to me quite profoundly in the sense of how we take so much for granted. And I didn't have the impression in my own experience that they take things nearly so much for granted. And in fact, I remember doing a lot of reading around the time and reading something that suggested that even the environment there in the American Southwest is so harsh. It's desert. And so it's not only dry and hot, but it gives them even more reason to need some of the resources that we tend to take so much for granted. And of course, that has not been the case. Did you dig a bit into the historical roots of the tribe and how they have managed to survive and get to the point where they are today?
Yeah, I think in general, when you're looking into the histories of any particular tribe, or in some cases what has now become a particular tribe, you can get a lot of varying accounts of how that came to be, especially obviously when you're looking at our own European or Western accounts of how those things came to be. So I'm always a little bit wary of that digging process, but through some of the stories and some of my interactions with particularly some of the elders that I have been able to meet, I had heard recent accounts of their parents and their upbringing, a lot of them through the boarding school system, and many of them shared accounts of the original passing of the legislation. I believe it was Public Law 93-531 in Arizona, which is the original legislation that had stated that the Hopi and the Dene were in a state of unrest, and that the public law was being enacted to essentially separate the two groups and redraw the territory lines. Now, when you talk to the elders, again, not to generalize, but those of them that I was able to talk to, what they say largely is that actually there wasn't too much conflict happening at that time between the two groups, but that it was a very divisive piece of legislation that was meant to separate the two groups right on the line of where the coal deposit was found. And so when you look back at that history, by the official record, there was only about 100 and maybe 80 families that they were attempting to relocate, but by the Dene and the Hopis' own records, it was more like 300 families that they were attempting to relocate through this. Some families signed that paperwork for relocation and did so, and others are still resisting relocation today, which is where the Black Mesa Indigenous Support Group comes in. So that was a little bit of the history, the more recent history that I had heard that had kind of put them in kind of the destitute situation that they're in right now, because there's been a lot of health problems from the mining. The water has been contaminated. So what little water they do have is largely unsafe, although they have no other option. So a lot of them still utilize the water for drinking and bathing and cooking purposes. And there's been a lot of health issues intergenerationally that have come up from this.
Mm-hmm. And I remember reading also, you mentioned the coal mining, which is a huge issue that you worked with, but I also remember reading that there's been a number of uranium mines over the last several decades, which have largely been abandoned now, but there's estimated to be over 1,000 of these abandoned uranium mine shafts on Navajo land today. And a lot of people don't have flooring in their homes, and a lot of the land that has been just so terribly abused there over all the decades is now a part of their everyday life, and they, as you said, have no choice but to just live in it and with it, and yet there's no compensation, often no choices to be able to do something unless they risk being displaced or move to a different location. And my experience has been that they are very committed to being in certain places. And this gets us back to the place conversation, which I know it's a little bit hard to discuss because their relationship to place, as you said, is quite different than maybe I would think about it. But they have a tradition that I have heard about where when a child is born, they actually bury the umbilical cord near a tree, and that becomes the child's tree. And so when they are forced to move off the land, they're literally leaving themselves behind on some level. And this begins to open the door, for me at least, to start to understand just how traumatic that can be. As someone who's moved many times in my own lifetime, and sometimes I'm more attached to the place, I guess, than others, but it's a completely different way of looking at what happens to people when the very land that they live on is being abused or upset in some way. When you were talking and working with the people there, what were the kinds of experiences that you had, or maybe some of the ideas that they shared about their own relationship to the land?
Well, there were several ways in which I was able and really privileged to be able to experience that. My first time going to Black Mesa, I was able to help with the planting of the corn crop. And this was something that really struck me because there were several plots that they had set aside for corn and other crops. And these plots, through stories that I had heard from their grandmother, had been in their family for, I think, 3 generations. And there was something about the trip, because it wasn't immediately next to their land, but there was something about the trip and following their grandmother up and down these really arduous climbs in some cases, and she was, I think, about 85. There was something about that trip that really started to sink down into you, this kind of ethereal feeling of what that must have meant to her to be going back every year, to be planting, to be harvesting the corn in the same ways that she had been taught. And I'm not really certain how to describe it in a way that makes sense, but I guess suffice it to say that it was a very prominent moment of my time there. Another way was I had helped them both of the times that I had gone out herding the sheep. Most families have fairly large herds of sheep, And those are very, very important to their sustenance out there, not just for food, but they also use the wool to create yarn, and they dye their own, and then they create these beautiful loomed rugs. And that's a way that they make money, is by going into town selling these rugs, and they'll come back with various groceries or supplies that they're unable to grow out there with their lack of water and largely lack of shade. It's a very typical high desert, so the only trees really that exist there are small, raggedy juniper trees, and the rest is essentially sagebrush and a little bit of grass every now and then. So there were lots of moments being out there. I would go out with the sheep for 8 to 10 hours a day. You kind of stick with them and ensure that nothing happens. There's wolves and various things that can attempt to attack the herds. So there was a lot of silence in a way that I hadn't really experienced prior to going out there, and that silence is really an important aspect to their culture and to their language, which I think was something as well that was very striking my first visit. But that silence, I think, comes less from the language and more from the land itself, which is really where they get their language from. So to experience the land there is to experience this profound stillness that I think many of us maybe will never experience in life. But if you get the opportunity, I would highly recommend it. There was something very moving about that. Time really slowed down in a way that allowed me to maybe just hint at an understanding of their way of life.
Yeah, I can relate to that sense of silence, and it, for me, made me feel just more connected to everything, as if I were a part of that tapestry of creation, really, that exists and in our daily busy lives that many of us lead, often in front of computers or with media, exactly as we are here. I think that piece is missing, and talk about giving you a different perspective and a different way to begin to understand things. That sense of being connected to something bigger is something that I think is very much missing in our culture. And it's amazing to imagine how the lifestyles of the Diné must have changed so dramatically when Europeans showed up. For example, I think that it's really important, actually, that we mention here that one of the historical events that probably plays a huge role in their own memory and history, in addition to the boarding schools that you mentioned, which were just devastating for so many reasons, but also there's this incident of what is now known as the Long Walk. And maybe you had some experience with them, but this was basically the tragic displacement of the Diné, where they were literally forced to march from one location to another when Kit Carson came in and began burning their homes and stealing their livestock. And once they basically had surrendered, more than 8,500 of them were forced to march to Fort Sumner, which was several hundred miles away from their particular land. And this was something that they eventually were allowed to return to their land, but things had just changed so drastically, I think, at that point, that it must most certainly play a role in how they feel today about themselves, about the land, and also even for their future, to begin to understand how quickly things can change and that can be lost. I wonder if you, in your work with them, I know that you were looking at the coal mines and some other things that are really threatening their way of life and their livelihood at this point in time. Can you share more about what that work consisted of, and maybe we can begin to look at some of the conclusions that you have personally come to through your own process of researching?
Yeah, I think if anything, one of the major shifts that happened inside of me, but also within my approach to the research, was kind of a lack of conclusions, really, more than coming to any specific conclusion. I think it really made me step back for a moment, because I think that one thing that is almost universal amongst a lot of the tribes, and especially the Diné and Hopi and people that live in the Southwest, It's kind of this mated in a cage sort of feeling, that we tend to kind of come in with these preconceived notions, this romanticized version of them as people and as a people. And I think that really steered me away ultimately from continuing to pursue research in kind of the classic sense with them, because what I really discovered when I was there and asking them these serious questions and trying to dig deeper into these issues, a lot of those notions that I had come in with kind of came back in my face and just kind of hung in the room in this really uncomfortable way, because they weren't real. They weren't the truth of the matter. They were these tapestries, as it were, that I had kind of woven coming in. And I think the stark silence and truthfulness with which they approach each other and the world and language and you when you're there in the room, it kind of evaporates the rest of those things and it just becomes words. And it's not really an appreciated approach to come in with these preconceived research questions, because what is most pressing to them are these issues. What's most pressing to them is, are you here in a way that can help? What I need is for you to herd the sheep. What I need for you is to go get water. What I need for you is to chop wood for this ceremony. So really, I think the most important thing that came of my research is kind of this disillusionment of my approach to research with them, which I think is institutionally maybe a cop-out, but I think in a really heartfelt way, the best approach you can take with them, especially right now, is to just show up in a very human and very authentic way and just ask, how can I help? And I think that's really starting to shift through organizations like Black Mesa Indigenous Support, where they are allowing and inviting people from outside of their circles to come in and experience life and experience the issues that they are facing. In one of the short interviews I had with one of the mothers, I asked, how do you feel, essentially very bluntly, about white people coming in and asking how to speak your language and asking, all of these sometimes trivial questions? And she said, right now, given everything that's going on, we are very inviting to those people, because when they come in, very practically, they bring technology, they bring their video cameras. And so when something is happening, when these SWAT teams, in some cases, are showing up to confiscate half of their herd because they're over this supposed limit of number of sheep that they're allowed to have, there's someone there that can hold them responsible and capture the moment, and someone there that, in their eyes, there will be consequences if they are messed with, if their equipment is taken away, in a way that seemingly they are generally not held accountable for, because they are allowed to go in and do those things to the people that live there, and they have no voice. So I think that they're at a point now where they're okay with people coming in a way that helps them to have a voice, and not in a way that continues to strip them of that voice by framing their thoughts and actions in a nice little way that we, in some cases, approach research.
Yeah, I think you're making a really good point. And we haven't mentioned Carl Jung at all in this conversation, but he had suggested, based in part, I guess, on his visit to the Pueblo Indians in Taos primarily, that the collective psyche is often most deeply influenced by the culture that existed on the land before the dominant culture. And so his idea is that we are all deeply affected by this. Obviously, we are all interconnected on some level. And then the question of us going in there as, to your point, members of the dominant sort of Western society and having these kinds of expectations that things are going to go a certain way, or that we already think we know what we're going to find when we start asking these kinds of questions, is a really critical piece that we have to begin to question. And it sounds like what you're saying, and I think the depth psychology way, I guess, if you can look at it from that standpoint, is to really just go in with an open mind and a desire to help No, I take that back. The desire to help is not necessarily always a good thing because we're already automatically inserting ourselves into that process because we think we have an idea in mind of how we might be of help probably. So it's much more about going in and just being open to what arises, just being present to the moment and trying to keep those filters and those biases at bay that we discussed earlier. And it sounds like you really had a profound opportunity to do that. And I really like that you're able to say at this point, Jonathan, that that is what you discovered, was that you can't come back and have conclusions about the right way to do research necessarily with Indigenous peoples or anybody that's a different culture than our own or a different group than our own, but rather to be able to say it's about just being there and showing up. And I think that's really profound. Is there more from a depth psychological standpoint that depth psychology can learn from the experience of those people at Black Mesa?
Yeah, and I think that you were touching on it. Speaking of the collective unconscious and the world soul, the anima mundi, I really feel that right now is a very prominent point in history in that there's a lot being said through people that are indigenous to these various areas, as well as people in general that are part of some of these marginalized groups. You see a lot of conversations coming up around Black Lives Matter right now, around the DAPL, the pipeline in North Dakota. And in the same way, I think that you see it here at Black Mesa through the Dene. I think a lot of them are speaking up for not just the environment, but really they are voicing the concerns largely of our collective unconscious and of the anima mundi. And I think that that is something right now in this exact point in history that very much needs to be heeded and needs to be followed. So I think through depth psychology, you can learn to deconstruct some of the original ways that we might begin to view some of these issues, and you can learn some entrance into the collective unconscious and various, I suppose, platforms for understanding the unity of all of these systems and people. And then at some point, I think you have to also be willing to let go of even those notions and allow the voices and the people that are really the forefront of these movements to be the ones to speak. So I think if we as depth psychologists are able to provide more mainstream platforms for those voices, then that is in itself a huge addition to their cause, and I think largely a way in which the field will be able to truly learn the foundational aspects of some of these conversations that are beginning to arise.
Yes, and what you have brought up here, which we haven't said explicitly, is something that I think is really critical, and that is that depth psychology really is focused on listening to the voices that are at the margins and looking at what is hidden or under the surface of things in order to begin to better understand ourselves and our place in the world around us and the world around us. And I think that the process that you are describing is very powerful, and that is to be able to allow these voices and these images to emerge into our own consciousness without judging them, without labeling them so much. It becomes very difficult when you actually try to have a conversation about it, doesn't it? I feel like some of our conversation today, I have really been searching for words and ways to talk about the concepts, but it's because it's so deeply ingrained in each of us, and that as soon as you begin to be aware how much on a regular basis we all make those kinds of assumptions and labels and thoughts and ideas, it begins to become a different place where words are harder to find and language is a little bit harder to use. I like this quote from Fred Gustafson, who is a Jungian analyst, and he wrote a really lovely book called Dancing Between Two Worlds. And in it, he discusses how we each have an indigenous soul, and he calls that a forgotten place within ourselves. And that's referring to an abandoned ancestral life that calls out to us to reconnect with a sense of close belonging and to reclaim the earth as a living and a soulful body. And so once you begin to be able to come into some kind of relationship with that idea that we each have this indigenous piece of ourselves that is crying out really to be reconnected, not only with something greater than ourselves, but with the planet itself, with the earth, the kind of dirt that you can dig your hands into, and all of the people, there's the four-legged people and the two-legged people and the different groups that you had mentioned when you were talking about how the Diné call themselves the people. And as we begin to put all this together into some form of understanding, maybe what emerges for me the most is that a depth psychological lens is really about, on some level, removing the lens, or at least softening it to the extent that we can begin to see what is beneath that lens that we so typically use, each one of us, and begin to tap into the essential reality of what is already there. Did you have some final thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think I'd like to end with summating what you've just said with that concept that we spoke of earlier of experiencing silence, because I really find that idea of silence versus noise versus a busy mind and busy hands, I find it to be really profound and something that continues to work on me every time I come back into contact with not just these people, but with this sense of living. I think that there's so much lost in attempting to find the words for things, which is not to say that naming things is not important, because that's also something that's very dear to the Diné as well as to other indigenous cultures. But I think that right naming of things comes into play only when there's been a certain amount of silence or space that has been honored prior to giving that name. I think in our cultures, we so often continue to try to fill the silence, to fill the voids in conversations, and to fill the voids in our lives with these words and words and words. They continue to build on each other, and you're building on a foundation that is not solid or is not based on any real experience, but rather you're trying to, through the language, find your way down to that foundation. And I would just warn against that, or maybe not be so ominous about it, but maybe say that there's so much wisdom that can come from just being in silence. And I think that that is really the most important lesson from these cultures, because when you are silent is when you're able to hear those other voices speak.
That's really beautiful. Jonathan, thank you so much for spending time with me today. It's been just so interesting to hear about your own work with the Diné people in Black Mesa. I know that there are a couple of different ways that you recommend that if people would like to get involved, they can do that. Can you just share that with us as we close here?
Yeah, I would love it if people would go to supportblackmesa.org, as well as if you'd like to check out more of what's going on in India at Sristi Village. There's sristivillage.org, SRISTI village.org. Just see how you can get involved. If these are things that really interest you, I think you would learn a lot from just going. And there's so much to be said for really giving up your time versus some other resources such as money or writing papers. I think really giving up your time is something that's very valued in both of those places.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I've been speaking with Jonathan Rudo, who is working toward his PhD in depth psychology in the Community Liberation and Eco-Psychology program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And Jonathan, I so appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Discussions in Depth Psychology, powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute with host Bonnie Bright.